Thanks everyone for joining us again today, or perhaps for some of you the first time. I hope everything is well with everyone during what I think, I kind of lost count, is the 10th week of lockdown. Fairly staggering thing to say. I don't think I would have imagined saying that even 3 months ago, let alone 6 months ago. Today that you find our event really useful. Joining us today, we have Gary Morris and Sarah Hopkins from our Bristol WYG team. I'm afraid you are, as you've probably guessed, stuck with me as chair again. And I'm also really pleased with our special guest today, Bruno Moore, Head of Town Planning and Transport, joining us from Sainsbury's and Argos Group. Quite possibly by chance, I'm not sure. I'm going to say it's entirely deliberate and well planned of us. This retail webinar comes off the back of quite a significant announcement made by the government in respect of easing the lockdown and opening of non-essential retail outlets. I'm going to, just before we kick off with the questions, just pass on to Sarah for a minute, just on her thoughts really on these latest announcements and some more feedback generally on your experiences with retail and planning over the last few weeks. Sarah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it is good news. The government has sort of set out their vital framework to get the shops reopen and the high street back working for the community. So we've got the outdoor markets and the car showrooms opening next Monday and the 1st of June. And then from the 15th of June, we've got non-essential shops able to open as well, as long as they're made COVID secure. And I think that's the key to it. There's quite a lot of guidance out there and going to be a lot of preparation for these shops to do in the intervening period. And there is guidance now from the government of how that might shape up. Everything from introducing social distancing measures, as the supermarkets are more now familiar with the 2-metre distancing and the queuing outside, but also things like suggesting the new stock is stored for 72 hours before putting them back on the shop shelves, and also putting protective covering on those large items like beds and sofas and stuff. So, you know, gone are the days where we might be all lying on a bed in a shop. For the moment, that is past. And again, it's going to be putting in those measures of cleaning regularly, surfaces and objects that might be touched regularly, and having availability of like hand sanitizers and stuff. And it is something that, you know, they're going to have to take very, very seriously. The government have suggested there could be fines if, you know, they're not implemented properly, and but it's definitely a good news to start opening these non-essential stores and hopefully getting these high streets back active. The ones that aren't yet covered in terms of a time frame are the sort of bars and restaurants and hairdressers and nail bars. So unfortunately for us, we won't be able to get those hair cuts and those nails done in the short term. It will have to be what we're doing at home in terms of allowing our brothers and sisters to do our hair. So yeah, but it is good news, and it's a big step in the right direction.
Thanks, Sarah. And yeah, some interesting. It'll be interesting, I think, generally to see how those changes take place. I know on a personal level that Gary and Bruno will be particularly devastated about the nail bars. In terms of kind of both short term, I suppose, and long term, we've got a question on our email, which is quite a general one, but I think it's an important one to cover today. Gary, I was just wondering, do you have any thoughts in particular on how high streets will need to adapt post-lockdown, you know, both within this ease lockdown, I suppose, and more longer term as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two approaches, as you say, short term and a long term. And I think, you know, to put it bluntly, in the short term, frankly, anything they can do. I think shops and restaurants and any main town centre users is going to have to try and make use of outside space as much as possible. It's clear that that's a safer environment. I think shops and restaurants that are perhaps in centres and pedestrianised areas have got a bit more to work with there. Shops that are perhaps in front of narrow pavement areas, it's going to be a bit more difficult, but they've got to make the use of anything they can. So I think restaurants, we need to be exploring this perhaps the continental experience of eating outside, so putting up canopies, using blankets, heaters, whatever. And I think it's retailers and I include restaurant operators in that are going to have to think imaginatively, and we're going to have to think outside the box. And for those that can't take their experience outside, frankly, they're probably going to be using outside space for queuing to get in. I think in terms of what planning can do in that short term, there are some permitted development rights that have been brought in, and I think Sarah will probably talk about those a little bit. But frankly, probably one of the biggest things that planning can do is turn a blind eye. There'll be things that some retailers will need to do to survive that might involve doing things that might need a planning permission. And I know the government wrote to councils asking them to be lenient in terms of enforcement for nighttime deliveries at the beginning of the lockdown, and I think that sort of attitude in the short term needs to come through more. In the long term, I think the answer is different for city centres than it is for local high streets. I think I probably feel for city centres a bit more than I do for local high streets, because I think the challenge for them will be quite significant. I think any plans that they had in place before, and let's face it, our high streets and our centres were facing challenges before, and they're going to be facing even bigger challenges. And so, I mean, look at what M&S have done, for example. They've ripped up their old programme and they've set up a new programme, and it's called Never the Same Again. And I think that says it all, really. It is never going to be the same again, because they've got to deal with the challenges before and the new challenges. So I think a lot of city centres, they're too big, so we need to look at shrinking them down a bit. I think we're going to need to look at repurposing vacant space. I suspect when we eventually come out of this, I suspect that there'll be quite a few familiar names that will be a lot less familiar, because I suspect some of them won't be there. So we need to look at how we deal with those city centres and diversify their range of uses, not just traditional town centre uses, but looking at getting residential into them as well, creating new communities. I think for the local high streets, I think there's actually potentially an opportunity here, because one thing that I feel that that COVID-19 has done for us is given us a sense of community. And there were some interesting figures out today from Kantar that small shops, so corner shops, independent retailers, 63% jump in trade. And that just shows that we're shopping locally a lot more, partly from the fear factor of travelling further, partly from the sort of the transport aspect of that. But I think there's a comfort in walking to your local shops and getting things. And I think if local high streets can capitalise on that, then there's a real opportunity there for them. So I mean, there's in retail terms, there's been two big winners, haven't there? There's been the internet has been a big winner, and I think these local corner shops need to make the most of that.
Yeah, definitely. That's certainly just on, I suppose, more on a personal view rather than professional. That certainly seems to be what's happening. And what I would say is, it seems to me, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that supermarkets, they've kind of been the first to step up and get things sorted, I suppose, because they are an essential facility. Just Bruno, turning to you on that. I mean, coming away slightly from high streets, how have you adapted, and how are you planning to adapt in the sort of more supermarkets and larger stores area?
Well, in terms of supermarkets, we've had to do, all the sort of social distancing. I'm sure everyone on the call's been to a supermarket since lockdown rules came into effect. But we've sort of put in place all the measures you might expect. It's obviously easier in out of centre locations with large car parks to put in place queuing sort of systems. But I think by and large, customers have been fantastic in terms of being patient. People get it, and people are very good at sort of keeping the 2 meters distances. It does become more tricky in high streets when you've got queues outside stores, and equally it occurred to me today, what member of my team Adam said to me, when other shops open up, you're going to get mingling of queues. So how's that going to work if you've got another shop next door that's open? Because at the moment you've got a Sainsbury's local corner shop further down the road, and they're fairly well separated, so the queue can tail back past other shop fronts, and it's not a problem. But as they start to open up as well, how's that going to work? Which makes it more difficult. We have had a sort of slightly different approach to some of the other retailers. So Tesco introduced a one-way system in the aisles to maintain social distancing. people being people, customers didn't like sort of like, you know, having to follow all my system around a store. And human nature is if you walk past something, you walk back up to go and get it. And I think the Tesco's experience was that was bringing customers into conflict with each other, which was then undermining all the social distancing good works, because people then sort of like, you know, obviously maintaining a 2 metre distance from each other, but having arguments with regards to where you could back up to get your aubergine sort of thing. So the response, by and large, right across the industry, I think the response has been fantastic, but there have been slightly different nuances. So Sainsbury's, for example, we like our customers to come and shop only one adult at a time, and that is at variance to Tesco and the other supermarkets who let groups of people shop. But that was a view we took, and that's where we're going. But generally, it's pretty much the same. In the long term, I think there's been talking about sort of like how people are going to shop in the future. Basically, we've seen at the moment our online shopping is at 15% of total sales. Before lockdown happened, it was 7%. If you think Sainsbury's have been doing online sales for the last 20 years, pretty much, and in that time, our total sales have only grown to 7%. And in these extraordinary times, that's only really at 15%. Of grocery sales. Obviously, comparison sales will be slightly different. And at lunchtime today, ONS figures came out that backed up the Sainsbury's. It was on the radio at lunchtime, basically saying that nationally, it's 13% of grocery sales are at 13%. So I think people can get carried away with the idea that in future, all grocery sales are going to be online. In this extraordinary period of disruption, we're still doing 97% of our food shopping in a physical sense by going to a store. So that's sort of something worth bearing in mind. And so obviously in post-lockdown, I think we'll see us carrying on sort of like food retailing in a physical sense very strongly. And the other thing that I'd flag is that we've also seen a change in shopping habits. Whilst food sales have been sustained through lockdown, we're seeing customers, we've halved our number of weekly transactions, which obviously means people, when they go to the shops, they're buying twice as much as they would normally buy. So we're seeing increased food sales, although not huge, but increased food sales ahead of what we do normally expect this time of year. But we're only getting half the customers, so effectively it means that when the customers are coming, they're buying twice as much. So they were returning possibly more to the sort of weekly shop type, sort of like patterns we've seen in the past. Whether that's sustained past lockdown, who knows? We'll have to wait and see.
Thanks, Bruno. I'm keen shortly to get onto some planning, because I think that's the big reason why a lot of us are here.
No, I'm not.
Trying to keep it on the fly there. But I am just a question has popped up from Nigel Abbott actually on our chat facility. It's on the right hand side for those of you who joined late. And I think it's just an important one to answer while we're here, just talking about the sort of more temporary lockdown periods. What is the position with non-essential retail units solely accessible from within enclosed shopping centres? I mean, I'm assuming that they are subject to the same rules as all non-essentials coming in on the 15th of June. Sarah, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I believe they are, whether they're in a high street or whether they're in an existing shopping centre. Ultimately, I guess it will be dependent on sort of the landlord, the management company of that shopping centre, but I would have thought they would be keen to get back as well. I think the difficulty for the non-essential ones is that we're all prepared to do that queuing for an essential item, whether it's outside a chemist or outside a supermarket. But when you're talking about clothes shopping, and if there is a queue outside, do you think we are going to, join that queue just to go and have a look at Primark? I don't know. It might be a bit more difficult for them to achieve that. But yeah, no, I don't believe there's any difference in terms of high streets or shopping centres there, as long as they are implementing those social distancing guidelines and the measures that the government have wanted to see to make things safe. I believe there's no difference and they can do it. I think what will be more difficult is to get people back onto the high street to actually start using these non-essential shops. I think, Bruno's mentioned about the ONS data, and one of the things that is notable is that the clothing sales are down 50%. So I think in terms of, because of the lockdown, we don't feel we need new clothes. We're not going anywhere. We have no parties or events to attend. And so, that is something that in the short term, at least, is likely to stay as a trend. I think the only thing in terms of goods that is actually up is alcohol sales. So they're up 2.5%. So yeah, I think it is going to be more difficult for those non-essential ones, but certainly no difference whether we're in a shopping centre or on a high street.
Thanks, Sarah. We do have another interesting question about adaptation of kind of local high streets from Simon Coles. Simon, I will get to you. That ties in with one of our email questions as well. So I'll sort of talk about or potentially have some questions on how we might see a shift in where and what people are shopping for. Just turning to, because we do have a few questions actually in terms of planning policy and the role of the high street and whether it needs to be repurposed. Do we need to look at use classes or permitted development rights? I mean, Gary, how do you think that planning policy might change to assist both town centres, and how can we encourage local authorities to look at potentially repurposing high streets as we know them?
Well, I think certainly for city centres and to some extent also for smaller centres as well, they've basically got to diversify. You know, our internet shopping was around before. There's no secret about that, and it was on a one direction in terms of it was only getting more. But I think we've seen it boost forward by about 5 years in the space of about 10 weeks. So there's even more of a challenge for the planning system to help out our centres. So you know, the thing that you can't do online generally is a leisure activity, and retail is a leisure activity, but in itself I don't think that's enough. So it needs to be combined with other leisure activities, and they already are to some extent, but I think there's got to be even more. So I think the shopping experience in centres has got to become more event based. I think we need to see more in terms of specialist markets that have been very successful, and I think we've got to start using our city centre spaces for more and diversifying those uses. So I think the planning system can play a part in two ways. I think one, from a policy perspective, we can make things a bit easier, and whether that goes as far as just completely releasing the use classes and letting the market take over in terms of what can go in the city centre, as long as it brings in people, whether we have some kind of prior approval system that it's an automatic planning permission for a change of uses, and you just consider the impact of that in terms of noise or smells or whatever, or whether it's something a bit more than that. But I think that's on the policy side, and I think on the development control side, I think we've just got to be realistic. And at the end of the day, if a developer is prepared to spend money in a centre that brings in people, I think we've just got to go with it to some extent. I think we can't be too precious about of having the dream solution, and a lot of these policies that have A1 only in our centres, I think, are just a bit draconian and a bit out of date, and I think we've got to start updating that.
So I had a little wobble there on my computer systems. There's always going to be one of us that has it. Sarah, I know we've had discussions just between ourselves in terms of potential kind of planning solutions for repurposing the high streets. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I would agree with Gary that the whole idea of having these sort of primary and secondary shopping frontages and having policies that mean that you can have nothing apart from a shop in the primary shopping frontages is really too dated now. And in fact, I think the government are ahead of maybe some of the local planning authorities in that respect, in terms of, the MPPG is actually saying that, you don't need to be doing this unless you really need to justify that approach is going to help the vitality and viability of that town centre. But there's also a number of other tools that really are already available for local planning authorities. One of the ones, again, which is set out in the MPPG is the idea of a local development order. And that's, where we can actually just relax planning and effectively say in that area, you don't need to get planning permission for a variety of things. And there have been some examples of them being used in town centres as being encouraged by the MPPG. So Bradford City Centre, the City Council there has done 2 local development orders. One of them is just a change of use for the building, and it can be of any building, and if they're changing it to a shop or a financial services, an A2 or A3 or A5, or offices, or residential. So that is something that they're allowed to do, and that, you know, they're quite flexible, these local development orders. You can put conditions on, and you can time limit them as well. And they've also got a second one operating in their city centre, which is able to look at upper floors. And again, it goes to the heart of how we might sort of kickstart the high street, is to get people living back in them. So again, they are able, they've done a local development order in their city centre, effectively saying at upper floors, you can create 6 units for residential flats above upper floors. And again, I think, you know, this is a technique and a tool that's open to local planning authorities now, and one that really could, you know, take away that burden of the planning system to actually get some of these voids up and running. And there's various things on use classes orders and permitted development rights within those. But you know what? They are just so complicated. You know, some only apply for 500 square metres, some only 150 square metres, not if you're in a listed building, not if you're in a conservation area, you have to do a prior approval. And it's more, nearly as complicated as putting a planning application in. And so I think this sort of area-wide approach for a local development order is a really good thing that local planning authorities should look into. And I think it would allow to take the burden of planning away and actually get some uses back into these voids. And I think it's something they're really going to have to look at carefully going forward.
Thanks, Sarah. If I could just a reminder for those who probably came on slightly later, if everyone can go to mute and just switch off their cameras as well. It just wreaks havoc sometimes with some of our audio and visual as well. So just a reminder for those. Julie Diamond actually has a question just on what Sarah's saying. Do you think that the relaxation of planning rules and introduction of LDOs is potentially futile when other regimes such as licensing or the police would conflict with this approach? I mean, it's a good question, isn't it? Because we are talking about issues that are wider than planning potentially, or certainly I would say maybe wider than development management. And that's where LDOs, I suppose, come in, because it's about a vision for that high street or for that area. Sarah, did you want to pick up on that?
I would say that we've always had those sort of parallel regimes, haven't we? So, you know, planning has always dealt with things like noise and the air quality and odours, but then you also have other regimes similarly doing that in terms of noise nuisance and the health and safety executive. So those regimes have always been in play, and we've always sort of sat alongside each other. I don't think it should put off local planning authorities. In fact, it should give them the confidence to do it. So actually, if you get to a point that some use is causing a noise nuisance or another nuisance, there is another regime that would put that in place, whether it's the police or whether it's the local authority health service. Right. And can't think of the right term. And so yeah, so I think it actually should give them the confidence to actually relax the planning because there are these other regimes, rather than put them off doing it. So.
Thanks, Sarah. And I've noticed Bruno shifting around, because I think you've heard the 2 golden words use classes order. That's 3 words, actually. Yeah. Bruno, I know you certainly have your thoughts on this. I mean, is there a place for reviewing / ripping up / you know, wholly rethinking the use classes?
I feel slightly conflicted on use classes orders, because obviously from Sainsbury's point of view, we quite like the use classes order, because we like the ratchet effect. That means you can go from A3 to A2 to A1, but you can't go the other way. And from a purely sort of commercial point of view, it means that when we're looking to acquire a sort of a site for one of our locals, we're not in competition with the, you know, the estate agents or with the restaurants or whatever in a large amount of cases. Having said that, and that's why you'll find Sainsbury's aren't weighing into this debate with any particular vigour, but having said that, it makes a huge amount of sense just to deregulate the town centres and the use classes order in terms of like looking after the health of town centres. I think we all know from experience that if you allow councils to control something, they will. In relation to if the ability is there to control it, then it's just human nature. It's not sort of anything to do with councils per se. But I think, what would be wrong with just having the definition of, an A2 unit being open to visiting members of the public? Why don't you just expand that to all town centre uses? And if it's open to visiting members of the public, then that's a town centre use. And therefore then we no longer have to spend ages tying ourselves in knots with this wine bar. That's a wine bar in the evening. It's selling alcohol during, it's an off license during the day, and it's got a jazz club with a bit of booze in the evenings. And we'll go, what use class does that fall into? Well, who cares, to be honest with you? It's open to visiting members of the public, and therefore it's an appropriate town centre use. And then we can let the other legislation, such as like noise, environmental health, all those kind of things, pick up the issues around whether there are issues in relation to that use that need to be dealt with. And maybe there might be a prior approval process, but it means that the principle would always be established, so you can actually sell a subject to use following some certain rules. Then you can get on with this use. So I think that's got to be the way forward with regards to our town centres. And I think the good news for town centres and high streets coming out of this is, if anything, lockdown has taught us is that we are gregarious beings. We like to come together. So what you've got to do is kind of find some use that you can locate in your high street that people want to go to actually congregate. So we've seen people in parks. People love a park, particularly in London or wherever, any urban area across the country. People like to congregate in parks, whatever. What are the things that you need to be introducing into your town centre where people want to go to rather than need? Because in the past we've always built our town centres based on a very sort of strict retail need model. Well, now people can sort of fulfil a lot of their retail needs elsewhere away from town centres, online, in our centre, let's face it, it's all our centre locations. So what can you replace those types of uses in town centres with to make people want to go there, such as coffee bars, high quality environments, cinemas, heaven forfend, betting shops? And I know that's a completely different sort of different debate, but that's something that people want to go and do, and that drives footfall in your town centres. And there's also issues around what's our working life going to look like post lockdown, and kind of changes in office environments, and does that represent an opportunity for town centres in the future?
Thanks, Bruno. I'm going to try and interlink two questions now, so bear with me, because we've got a really interesting one, as I mentioned before, from Simon Coles on our Teams chat. Firstly, will the more agile, smaller independent retailers be able to adapt better to the new era for our high streets than larger supermarkets and department stores? Now, Gary has touched on this slightly already, which makes me sort of think that the answer may be yes. If that is the case, then I would like to interlink with that. If that is the case, how can high streets innovate to overcome public transport implications for social distancing when we've been pushing for car free? Is it about a whole change in terms of where people shop fundamentally, or is it a different issue? Gary, can I come on to you first for that?
Well, I can certainly cover the first part of the question. We might have to wing it a bit on the second part of the question, but I mean, in terms of smaller retailers adapting, I think we're already seeing that. And I think, I mean, there's not been a lot that coronavirus has been good for, apart from Zoom and Teams meetings. But one of the things it has done is encouraged the smaller local retailers to embrace the internet, because they are now in a position whereby they are, apart from the supermarkets, they've been for the last 10 weeks, one of the few survivors. Some of the local shops, and our local butcher now has an online ordering facility and delivers. Never did that before, and probably wouldn't have been encouraged to do that before. But we've seen lots of businesses that have signed up to this model, and it's helping them engage this multi-channel approach. And I think the multi-channel approach is absolutely the success recipe going forwards. Because if you look at the way that a lot of our existing shops interact with the internet, so take Boots for example, 75% of their orders that are placed online are picked up in store, so they've already got that interaction between internet and physical retail. M&S, it's 71%, across the board it's about 50%. So I think as long as you can keep that connection going, and that's why the smaller retailers have to embrace that as well, so they've got to go multi-channel. And I think there's a role for centres to adapt and help with this as well, because it's probably a big ask, I think, that all retailers, all these small retailers, can all set up these facilities themselves. So maybe we need to be looking at sort of aggregating services where we have click and collect hubs. There are things that bring people in, and innovative ideas such as you get free returns if you take it back to the click and collect hub to take it back, for example. In terms of the transport question, can you repeat the question? Just refresh my mind on it.
I knew I was doing too much, even for me.
Yeah, I can't multitask. So I'd be a terrible retailer. But.
Yeah, one of the questions that came in on our Talking Town Planning email was how can high streets innovate to overcome public transport implications for social distancing when we've been pushing for car-free for so long, which is a really interesting one because it does, what we're seeing now potentially kind of goes against what we've been pushing for the last decade, certainly.
Yeah. It does completely, and I think the short answer is that there is no short-term solution to that. I think if we want people to come to our centres and they're being encouraged with good reason not to take public transport, then we're going to have to accept that they're going to have to come by car. We're going to have to make facilities available for that. So whether that's finding additional places for them to park, reducing parking charges because they will put people off going, whether it's we look at extended opening hours so we can spread that out more, so that for those that do have to come on public transport, they've got more opportunity, whether it's we pump prime bus services, for example, so that there's more of them for the temporary period so people can spread that out. It's not an easy one to answer that. It's not an easy nut to crack.
I think there is a suggestion though that in terms of this we have to assume, although maybe coming in sort of like a hopeless optimist, but we have to assume we'll be able to return to normal in a period of time, and so we can return to using public transport as normal. But the big difference is going to happen with regards to working patterns. And at the moment, all public transport has to have the capacity to meet the peak. Now, if that peak reduces, then we don't have to have as much public transport, or our public transport is a much more pleasant experience to use throughout the day because it's simply not as full. So, in the past, lots of, the city in London or wherever, right across a hard start of 9 o'clock in the morning, a hard finish at 5 o'clock, which creates huge headaches for our public transport infrastructure providers. But then in the future, you might be looking at far sort of, lower peaks. We all know we have to smooth the curve these days, don't we? That's the sort of that's the you see what I did there? That's the COVID terminology. But what does that do for our public transport system in terms of making them far nicer or more pleasant places to use round the clock with regards to? So I think there are some positives we can take out of this.
Yeah. And I think in the short term, I think you might have to accept, to get the high streets sort of back up and running and making them as convenient and accessible as possible to people, that people are more likely to use a car in the short term. But as Bruno said, we've got to assume that the need for social distancing is not going to be forever. And that in time that people will have the confidence to go back on to public transport, which will allow all those things and measures that we've been pushing in the last decade or so to carry on. But in the short term, the reality is social distancing is more important, I think, in the short term. And I've got a very annoying fly flying around me. But it is an interesting point about the fact that one of the things that maybe, as you said, the differences on way we work and how we feel we can work, that actually maybe the 9 to 5 and everyone in an office may be a thing of the past. And actually what it has proven is that for a lot of jobs, we can work very effectively at home. And so maybe those peaks will not be quite the same. And again, going back to your point, Gary, that maybe it will be those city centres and town centres that struggle more than maybe there be a bit more revival of the local shopping centres, because then, we'll be more at our homes in terms of neighbourhood shopping. And that's where we may work for part of the week or all of the week. Which again could well mean that there would be not only shops to repurpose, but also offices to repurpose within our sort of central areas, which is again something that the planning system is going to have to embrace and not put too many hurdles in the places. I mean, we obviously have the permitted development rights from offices to residential, but those kind of things will need to be accelerated, I would have thought, to get things moving again.
I suspect it's a good thing that PD is in place, because I think that's going to be quite a common conversion, as we have less need to have large offices in city centres, but we still need to get people there. So if the only way we can get them there is by them living there, well then all well and good.
Brilliant.
And they're going to be around in the daytime as well.
Yeah. Speaking of sort of moving things forward, we have had a question in from Helen Bilby, I hope I've said that correctly. My local authority has just produced a master plan for the city centre. To look at delivery of this in such testing times, what do you think would be the most important things to come forward quickly? I suppose we've said a lot of positive things about local centres, haven't we? But not necessarily. It looks like the city centres could potentially not be winning out on this. Gary, I'm going to come back to you on that one. What do you think are the key things to move these types of things forward quickly?
Helen probably won't like the answer that I'm going to give, but I don't want to go as far as to say we need to rip up the old plans, because I think it's probably a little bit premature to be saying that, because for all we know, these wonderful scientists might find a cure, and we might all be this might be a thing of the past in a year. But if this is something that we're stuck with, then those old plans are not necessarily going to be fit for purpose. And even if we're not stuck with this, I think we'll be stuck with the legacy of it in terms of the way that it's changed people's working habits and shopping habits. And I think some of those are for the better. I think in terms of encouraging a diverse workplace, I think the agile working that we're all embracing now, I think is a great thing, and I think that can certainly play into a more diverse working population. But of course, we have less need for these offices, as I've said. So any master plan that is predicated on delivering additional retail and additional office space, I would be very cautious about progressing with a master plan that had that at its core. Similarly, will we be needing to put so much emphasis on transport into centres if we're not having the attractions there? We still need to be bringing people into our centres, but I think in terms of the big city centre shopping and leisure environments, I think we need to be looking at event space. I think we need to be looking at creating things that actually serve as an attraction, something that you can countenance getting on the internet. I've drawn as an example before. That's a bit of an extreme example. In New York, there's a shopping centre, but which who needs another shopping centre in New York? But it's anchored by the Vessel, which is a fantastic piece of art, and it's a structure that people can walk around and interact with, and that brings people to that location because of that. And I say it's an extreme example, and whether we get anything like that in the UK, who knows? But I think we have to have a reason to bring people in, and that reason won't necessarily be shopping.
Thanks, Garen. I suspect the key word in it is vision, isn't it? And what's your vision for that area, and maybe review that vision and make sure that that's still relevant, because it might not be, or some elements might still be. And for me, I would certainly be saying, it needs to, particularly in these current circumstances, have an eye on what's going on commercially and be engaging with those that are running shops on the high street, or those retailers that play an important part, or indeed your anchor. Bruno, did you have any thoughts in terms of sort of local authority engagement on master plans and visions for their city and town centres?
Yeah, I think we're going to look at this. What the effect of this is going to be is accelerate trends that we've known about for a long time. And I think local authorities need to be brave. And by brave, I mean if they find themselves trying to maintain the kind of same amount of commercial floor space in their town city centres as they did before, I think they're barking at the wrong tree. They've been much better off identifying what is the really good quality areas of commercial and retail space and concentrating on that, and quite simply designing policies to let more secondary areas just convert to other uses, particularly around residential. And in terms of a bit of evidence to support that view, the London plan, which is grinding inexorably towards adoption potentially, if Sadiq and Robert Gendek can stop fighting each other. But that is, the plan identifies 239 centres within Greater London. Now there's lots of kind of policy and general statements within the text of the plan which talks about managed decline with regards to some of these centres, because simply there isn't any kind of like, well, some of them have to reinvent themselves, and obviously some of that means some of them have to reduce in size. But then if you look in the appendices of the plan, the 239 centres, only 6 are identified as changing categorisation over the lifetime of the plan. And none of those 6 are going down the hierarchy, they're all going up. So I think that's kind of evidence that local authorities, with regards to trying to transform their centres, aren't really grappling with the need to change them fundamentally. And I think your centres, if you allow the peripheries to go, then you can focus activity in a far tighter area, and I think that can only be good for health and vitality of your centres in the future. So that would be my view.
Thanks, Bruno. Yeah, so definitely a time of change. And with that, we haven't explored in too much detail today online shopping. And Graham Hell has put a question onto our meeting chat. Do you not think that people will be less inclined to venture into town for their shopping as a result of COVID and will rely on internet shopping instead? Sarah, you sort of touched on this, and particularly the difference between shopping for need and shopping for want, I suppose. So what was your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think that what the lockdown has done is probably opened up internet shopping to a sector of the community that probably has never done it. My 80-year-old neighbours are now regularly got the over 75 slot on Sainsbury's internet shopping, and think it's marvellous that they have a little man come with a van and deliver their shopping. And certainly they had never done that before, and have quite willingly said they would not go back. So it certainly has increased the attraction of that. But I think that what it also has shown that we do crave sort of social interaction, and I think that's what the high street has got over the internet, that they need to offer something different. There's still going to be that kind of need for most operators to be sort of that multi-channel, so they need to have those physical shops and they need to have that online presence. And if they can't do it alone, I think there's lots of ways that a smaller sort of traditional market high street might be able to club together in terms of getting an online presence together. But I think it's making it different. Let's have events in the streets, in the high street. Let's have personal shoppers. Let's have those quality experiences that you just simply can't get on the internet. And that's what's going to bring people and drive the footfall back to the high street. They've got to be different. They've got to be relevant. They've got to be a reason why we need to go. And I think ultimately, it's called comparison shopping for a reason, because we like to compare. And I think that's one of the things that it is easier to do when you have a collection of shops immediately around you. And once we get over this social distancing and need to queue, and whether that might or might not happen for when you're buying some socks over, I don't know, something from a chemist, I'm doubtful. But in the longer term, we will still want to go to town, I think, to go shopping. And I think it is making it something different, making it an event, making it that leisure experience, which is, the internet can't compete. You can't have a nice cappuccino, having a nice pastry, sitting looking at the riverside or whatever your town offers. So that's where their vision is going to be. It's going to be pulling out them something different that is offered that the internet can't deliver.
Is it all about high end, do we think?
No, not necessarily, because I think Primark is one of the success stories of our high street, and they don't have an online presence, which has certainly been costly for them in the short term. But again, they've been taking on that sort of high end turnover fashion, the fast fashion, in terms of things that are bought and thrown away. I mean, it might not be something very sustainable, but certainly Primark have really tapped into that and taken on people like Boohoo and Pretty Little Thing at their own game and done it very successfully. So it's not all about quality, it's about differentiating themselves and having that raison d'etre, isn't it? So yeah, certainly not all about quality, but that is something that is certainly something that can differentiate the high street over the internet in some respects.
We've thanks, Sarah. We've talked a lot about the high street today, and I'm just wondering whether we've had a question in. We have several questions in, really sort of not focused on the high street, and I'll just draw them together into a bit more of a general. Is it just the high street retailing facing challenges? Are challenges being faced elsewhere? Are they similar ones? Are they completely different? Bruno, if I could just take your views on that first, sort of being most relevant to you, I think.
Yeah, I think sort of obviously the debate in the past has always focused on sort of like outer centre and town centre retail. One of the biggest challenges that physical retail faces at the moment is challenge from online. Now Sainsbury's are a multi-channel retailer, so we wouldn't say sort of online's a bad thing, because we are a big online operator ourselves, both through Sainsbury's groceries online, but also Click and Collect and Argos as well. But what I would say, our view is that we need to level the playing field a bit more with regards to the rules of engagement and the costs of physical retail versus online retail. Now, the issues with and one of Sainsbury's biggest issues is around the rating system, and we are of one voice with other retailers, other supermarkets in relation to the amount of rates we have to pay. I think now, don't quote me on this, but I think Sainsbury's are the 70th largest company in the UK and we're the 7th highest taxpayer. And that's rates, and obviously income tax on employees and colleagues and stuff. But it's just that's how it skews the tax take. Now we haven't got a problem paying that, but it's got to be competitive with the likes of Amazon and stuff like that. So I think what we're looking for some kind of like leveling up of sort of like online retailers to make it a level playing field, because obviously physical retail has got distinct benefits in terms of providing strong local employment, so in local communities, regardless of whether it's in a centre or whether it's out of a centre. So I think that kind of I think the old school thinking with regards to if you restrict out of centre retail, it will go to the town centre it needs to be far more nuanced these days, because actually rather if you squeeze out a centre, it will probably go online rather than going to the town centre first. So that's my thoughts on that.
Thanks, Bruno. Sarah, what's your experiences? Are they very similar issues, the high street versus elsewhere, or slightly different?
Well, I think, the retail parks have been slightly sort of maybe out of fashion in recent times, but in the short term, they may well be better placed in some respects to deal with the sort of social distancing, similar to what Bruno was describing in terms of the supermarkets, that they do have the space to allow social distancing both inside and the queuing outside, and car parks which allow people to arrive currently in a safe manner. But again, they have been reliant on the sort of growth which has happened in the sort of leisure side of things, so the food and drink and the cinemas and gyms and those kind of things, just like the high street. And so with them being effectively also affected in this current times, it would be interesting to see how those retail parks in the longer term manage to sort of survive in terms of the reliance on that sort of leisure side is going to be more difficult. I think it might be a longer return for things like restaurants. I just don't see people wanting to maybe do sitting face to face in an environment with lots of other people sitting face to face and chatting and stuff. And we've ever seen various sort of ideas of shower curtains being pulled up between various tables, or whether we're sitting in greenhouses like the pictures we've seen from Amsterdam and stuff. And I think it's going to be a much slower return for the sort of restaurants and leisures, which will, I think, impact these sort of retail out-centre locations just as much as the high street, possibly more so. So I think they also have the same struggles, really. I think in the short term, at least.
We had a question about the sort of scanning through the emails on the temporary measures that have been brought in. Do we think that they are sufficient, and are there any other sort of more temporary measures that we can bring in to encourage people back to? The question was actually about restaurants and pubs, but I'm going to throw in shops as well because they're coming first. So do we think the temporary measures are sufficient, and are there any others that could be brought in to force fairly rapidly? And I need to throw that out to somebody, don't I? Let's go back to Gary.
Okay. The key one is to allow restaurants to become takeaways, but that was only for a year, so that's only until next year. Arguably, did they choose the right use class there? Because I imagine that most of the takeaway that's happening from restaurants that are open at the moment actually isn't takeaway, it's probably Deliveroo. So you can question whether actually the restaurants are turned into dark kitchens. But let's not get into that debate. Is it long enough? No, it's not long enough. It's nowhere near long enough, and there's nothing to say that it won't be renewed again. But a year gives them something to go on, but it doesn't allow them to plan in terms of changing their operating model, because you wouldn't go to a great deal of expense changing an operating model if you know that it could be whipped away from you next March. So I think that needs to be extended, and I think we need to look at that as a whole, and that does bring in the debate about Deliveroo, Uber Eats, Just Eat. None of that's going away, but I think we need to look at that permitted development right. There's nothing wrong in principle from the transaction not being a takeaway by the person that's bought it, but it's the knock-on impacts of noise from the delivery riders, for example. So whether we end up again with some kind of prior approval system, I mean, there was quite a high-profile case, Nando's and I think City of Westminster, in terms of the noise that the delivery riders were creating and the impact on traffic if they were congregating around a junction. So there's a lot of issues that need to be looked at there if we are moving away even temporarily from a restaurant to a delivery model. I don't know if anybody else wants to pick up on other changes to the planning system that we might do in the short term.
Yes, certainly. I mean, from my perspective, who probably has the least experience out of all of us in terms of retail planning, but I think one of the key things, it's not a permitted development right as such or anything or anything particularly technical. It's just more about working together, because it strikes me that the government's got their ideas and what can help, and the local authorities have, and so have we and our clients, and it's about trying to align those as much as possible and doing it as quickly as possible, and that inevitably is going to be, I was about to say face-to-face meetings. Sorry, I didn't mean to swear on our webinar. You know,
this is the new face-to-face, Rebecca.
Discussion, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, and I think it comes back to, I suppose, to the conversations about the master plan. You know, unfortunately, you may have worked on that for a very long time, and I suppose it's the case with all retail, isn't it? It's very fast moving. You know, and I think there does need to be genuine conversations, from what I've heard today, about how far planning seeks to restrict or control, should I say, the high street and retail generally, but also how far the market seeks to, you know, has an influence. Is that relationship changing? Who knows? Probably the test cases at the moment. We've got 5 minutes left, and as I said at the start, I did want to stick reasonably rigidly to that. One question I did just want to throw out there and I'll throw it out to Bruno first. In terms of your recent experiences talking about partnership working and having an open dialogue with local authorities, what are your experiences? Good, bad, ugly, indifferent?
My experience, I think Sainsbury's experience during the lockdown has been really positive, actually, with the exception of one glaring local authority who will remain nameless. I found local authorities are business as usual in terms of accepting planning applications, issuing decisions. I'd be interested to see what other people's experiences are. Also, we're currently doing sort of large schemes in RBKC, Royal Borough of Kensington, Chelsea. They are looking to move forward with planning policy documents that they're consulting on at the moment. And also, I've actually found that sort of using Teams and Zoom creates a more kind of informal environment. It's quite productive, and actually, don't get me wrong, but an intimate sort of atmosphere, so rather than sort of like formally, hello, shake your hand sort of thing. And actually, it's quite productive. It's quite easy to arrange meetings. Whether that's going to be maintained once we come out of lockdown and all planning officers and all people who work for large corporates go back to fanning about with large internal meetings forever and a day, I don't know. But at the moment, it's hush my mouth. At the moment, it's very positive, and I think hopefully it will kind of inform a new culture when we come out of this period of hiatus.
Yeah, I would agree, Bruno. In terms of getting meetings with local planning authority officers, they seem very ready. I can meet you tomorrow on Teams. It's very immediate. They seem to have really embraced it, and I think which is excellent, and probably find that I think some of that will continue in terms of that actually we can do things in a different way, and actually sometimes it is more efficient to do it in a different way. But just picking up one thing that about when you were saying going back to what the government could do in terms of assisting, so they have brought out a fund in terms of reopening the high street, but it's 50 million. So once you've carved that up between local authorities, it's quite small. So I think Bristol City Council, there's an appendix at the bottom, at the back of it, and it says how much each local authority will get of this 50 million. I think Bristol City Council had 400,000. So I'm not too sure what they might be able to achieve with that. But the ideas around it was all about assisting them with communicating with their communities, but also with businesses, and actually putting in temporary changes to the public realm as well. So I don't know quite what they think they might be achieved with 50 million, but I think one thing the government could do possibly is maybe increase that fund. In the short term, might be a good idea. But yeah, so that's just one thing to sort of pick up on your last question as well.
Yeah, and I know there is 90 million for local sort of public transport and pedestrian cycling facilities. There is also another funding stream, although I think that's been around for a little while. The new stations fund.
Oh yeah, and there is the towns fund as well, which is significantly larger. But
there are pots somewhere if you can get hold of them, and if you're very good with spreadsheets, I understand.
Yes.
So brilliant. Okay. So we've only got 2 minutes left, so I'll keep this brief. I mean, first of all, thanks everyone for coming. The weather is absolutely beautiful, so like particular thanks for today, and hopefully you get to see it soon. I will be quiet soon, I promise. Just to sort of wrap up what we've been talking about today, I mean, are the high streets history? That was the question that we asked at the start of this, and which hopefully piqued your interest to arrive in the first place. So I suppose drawing together what we've talked about today, the answer would appear to be no, but with some caveats. You know, they need to diversify both in terms of the city centre and local high streets, and there is definitely a repurposing which I think can be delivered through planning policy, through DM on a much more sort of short-term level, but it's going to take a partnership approach. And for me, the word I'll probably be taking away today is the vision, because actually if you have a vision for what people want, and it is a want rather than a need in their high street and in their retail areas, then I think it's much easier to select the appropriate tools to be able to deliver upon that vision. Also, depending on your timescales for that vision, is it a 20-year one or is it much shorter? I think also what I've seen today is that a lot of this is not necessarily a COVID-19 issue. The fact that people are, using the internet more, for example, for convenience shopping, that's been around for a while. It's just we've seen such a stark increase in the last 10 weeks that probably, as I think Gary's touched upon, would have been more of a 5-year trajectory. So everything's just been accelerated, and it does seem that the planning mechanisms are certainly there. In some form, once you've got a handle on your vision, and hopefully we can work with local authorities, clients, planning consultants, and all of the key stakeholders to work together on that. As I said at the start of the meeting, this is recorded. We'll be sharing it on LinkedIn, so do look out for that. If you'd like your own copy, please email us at talkingtownplanning@wig.com. If you've got any further questions that we didn't get around to today, or you just pop up in your mind 5 minutes later, use that email address again and we'll try and help out. This is our third session and we're intending to hopefully do more. So if you want to put any suggestions for future topics, we're doing them every 3 weeks. Again, if you feel differently about that frequency, just drop us a line, our email address. And as always, the whole point really of these seminars is so that we get a bit of interaction and to show we are open for business and we are looking out for our clients and our partners. And I think it's good to have this open dialogue. So again, if you've got any further questions, talkingtownplanning@wig.com. Hopefully that's in everybody's heads now, or do contact any of the team on LinkedIn. Thanks ever so much for coming today, and we'll see you again soon.